think we can get started for our second
Okay.
week with Zach, and guess introductions were made last week, so I'll just let Zach take it away and continue.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, everyone who is either returning for a second helping, or for those of you who are joining in new. Always happy to have new faces here. Like I did last time, I posted the link to the source sheet on the chat. So take a look on the chat, and you can use that link. And then I'll also obviously be screen sharing so that everybody's on the same page, literally and figuratively here. So let me get that started. Okay. Oh, wrong one. Okay, perfect. Can everybody see this the screen sharing right here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
and the lines did.
Perfect. Okay, good. So this last week, right, the sources that we looked at were for the most part connected to royal or elite culture, right? We looked at passages from the Book of Kings in terms of the Hebrew Bible. We looked at a lot of Assyrian royal inscriptions and things like that. This week, we're going to be looking at some of that, but we're really going to be migrating a little bit more towards what life may have actually been like for Judeans in exile. And so when we look at that kind of picture of daily life, we're going to have some different questions that come up, but we'll still have to kind of situate ourselves and make sure we know where we are first and foremost. So that's why this first slide here, this first source here, right, is kind of a map of the Babylonian Empire. This is a map of the Babylonian Empire really at its height, which is around the reign of Nebuchadnezzar the second, who obviously conquers Jerusalem. We'll be talking about him. His reign is from around 600 until around 560. So he reigns for around 40 years, which in the ancient world is a huge amount of time. And so at this point, right, you can see that the Babylonians control the modern day countries of Iraq. They control parts of Iran. They control parts of Turkey. They control Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, right? They control parts of modern day Arabia, things like that, right? So this is a massive, massive empire. Basically what happens is the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, and we read a lot about the Assyrians last week, and we kind of saw how the Assyrians describe themselves in their own words. But the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians and kind of finished them off in 612 BCE. So about 12 years before, or 10 years, give or take, before Nebuchadnezzar takes the throne, okay? And they finish off the Assyrians with the help of the Medes. So the Medes, you can see kind of in this map here, right? This is everything that's green. So they divide the Assyrian Empire. They divide up the Assyrian Empire between themselves, the Medes and the Babylonians do. And then by around 540, let's say, 535, the Babylonians themselves are going to be conquered by the next generation of the Medes, right? Who are going to be the Achaemenid Persians, right? The Medes, the Achaemenid Persians, these are all really kind of the same groups. We just call them different things for different reasons. But so that's just to give you a little bit of the background, okay, about what's going on and where we are. The first written source that we're going to really get into here is Psalm 137, right? This is something that I would imagine is probably familiar to a lot of you, but I would love to potentially look at this maybe in a new light. So who would like to read? Who could read for us, whether Hebrew or English, of Psalm 137 here?
All right, I'll start. You want me to do the Don McLean version of this one?
Go for it, right? If you want to break it to song, I'm always happy to join in.
Yeah, I don't think anyone else has ever said that. I feel it's by the rivers of Babylon. There we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung up our lyres for our captors. Asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs, Zion. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you. If I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried, strip her to her very foundations. Fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us, a blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks.
Okay, thank you very much. So what would you say really is the perspective here, right? What's the point of view from the narrators, whoever is telling this, right? Kind of getting past whoever wrote this in the first place, but whoever is telling this, whose voice is this in?
The exiles.
Great. All right. So on the first level, right, this is the exile's voice. Where specifically, right? Where are we talking about both temporally and physically? So when in time, right, are these exiles who have been in the land for a number of years at this point? Are these people who have just gotten there? Where are we talking about? And,
it sounds like they're on their way.
Good. Okay. So it sounds like they're on their way, right? What I love about this psalm is that it brings us really to a specific point. And that point is both a point in time and a point in space, right? The point in time is this group of exiles when they're on their way, right, from Jerusalem potentially to where they're going to be living in Babylon. And right, we're talking about kind of by the rivers of Babylon, obviously, right, from the first verse right there, but kind of right evoking imagery of the different trees that are around these rivers that we can hang up our musical instruments on and things like that. What's interesting though is, right, this psalm is in the past tense. So by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept, right? And so on the one hand, 100%, the point of view is from someone who is really kind of going through this exile's journey at the beginning of that journey, but the writer is writing this in the past tense. So the person who's writing this is already saying this is something that has already happened to us, right? So this is kind of the recollection of a community, whether they're in exile still, whether they're back in Jerusalem, we don't really know, right? I think you would have a lot of ammunition if you wanted to say that they're still in exile, but it's a community that is in exile and is kind of recounting that first, what the beginning of exile felt like to them. Good, okay. Other questions here. What seem to be what are the key concerns, right? What are the key concerns of this psalm? What's it trying to do, do you think?
It's trying to help us remember that we've got this native land that's different from where we're going.
Great, right? It's trying to help us remember this native land, which is different from where we're going, and potentially, right, if we want to buy into this idea that it's written in the past tense and it's written by a group that potentially is still in exile, it's different from where we are, right? And so on the one hand, it's evoking all of these images of, right, of Jerusalem, of Zion, and how, right, that you should kind of be the first thing that I remember, right? Whether it's good times, bad times, anything like that, and then going towards its destruction and things like that. But the central figure of Jerusalem and the land of Israel here is obviously, right, it's paramount about what's going on. What is interesting though is that you right, ask ourselves, why or when would that be necessary, right? Why would it be necessary to have this psalm where we can say, Jerusalem, we're never going to forget you. We're always going to remember all these terrible things that were done to you and things like that, right? To me, this strikes of, right, it's necessary to do something like that if potentially you have communities in the land where they're not necessarily always thinking about Jerusalem or Israel, right? If they're exiled and they're, maybe they're doing okay, right? That being said, if you read the psalm itself, the picture is totally the opposite, right? What is the picture of the exiles, right? What's their situation like?
Very unhappy.
Right. So on the one hand, right, very unhappy, absolutely. If anyone wants to speak, feel free, right? Unmute and just join in.
Would it be that they're assimilating into the society?
Right. This could very well be. So on the face level, absolutely, right? They're very unhappy. They wept, all these things. But I think, Ruth, what you're saying here could definitely strike a chord that potentially this may have been written when you have groups that are assimilating into this larger Babylonian society. And so we need we need a psalm, we need some sort of prayer, of song to have us refocus, right? And to kind of tell us how terrible it was in the beginning and how terrible these people were to us and all these bad things that they did and how important Israel and Jerusalem specifically are to us. Yeah, absolutely. There's one other key concern here that comes out to me. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? Okay, right? Ech nashir et shir Adonai al admat nechar. And so the reason why this is really interesting to me, right? It's not how can we sing a song of the Lord when we're so upset? How can we sing a song of the Lord when kind of we're surrounded by these captors, right? These peoples who have just did these terrible things to Jerusalem and Israel. I think what actually this is saying is this bringing up a really important theological point that we take for granted, right? In our lives, in our society, we take for granted that you can pray to God wherever you are, right? You can pray to this God that we know of from the Hebrew Bible wherever you are, whether you're in Alaska or whether you're in Jerusalem, okay? But for these exiles, that was not something that was self-evident, right? That this idea of the God of Israel, right, being someone who you could potentially pray to if you were not in Israel, right? And if your community was exiled from Israel, it's unclear how one does that, right? And we see this ambivalence in other parts of the Hebrew Bible as well. And so this idea of how can we sing a song to the Lord on alien soil, I think that's what's kind of evoking that, right? How can we do these normal things that we used to do in Jerusalem, in Israel, in terms of praising or praying to our God when we're no longer in the land?
Zach,
Okay.
was this the first instance of Israelites being confronted, becoming diaspora Jews?
So this is the first instance that we know of large percentages of Judahites, actually, right? So of the southern kingdom, because, right, if you remember, the northern kingdom was conquered by Assyria about 150 years before the exile. So the exile of the southern kingdom of Judah, right, and the destruction of Jerusalem happened in 586. The northern kingdom is destroyed 720 or 722. And so from this perspective, this is the first time that Judahites, right, people from that southern kingdom, Judeans, are in exile en masse. Absolutely. Yeah.
What is interesting, maybe you could address, is the fact that when they were allowed to go back 70 plus years later, they had a hard time getting the Judeans to go back. So there's something going on there that says, A, that they, because they didn't fully assimilate into Babylonia, not only they stood there and they were still Judeans, and plus, I'm sure somewhere within a couple hundred years, the Babylonian rabbinic authorities took hold because there's a Babylonian Talmud versus so maybe there's something there that you could explain.
Absolutely, right? That's going to be the focus of this session. I'm really going to try to focus on that, because if we look at the biblical sources, we see one thing, or we see a couple of things, right, that give us one impression or maybe two impressions at most. But if we look at some of these other sources that we have, we start to see a larger picture. And that picture, Norm, of what you're talking about in terms of why individuals might stay in the land when they're free to go back to Israel and to Jerusalem, right, after Cyrus conquers the Babylonians and kind of says, okay, right, Judeans, you can go back to your land. Why doesn't everyone go back, right? Why do we have the Babylonian Talmud? Why do we have this community in Babylon, right, in modern day Iraq for 2,500 years, right, until 1952, really, when pogroms in Baghdad and in Iraq and Kurdistan, things like that, right, forced them out. We have this community there for over 2.5 millennia. Absolutely. Okay.
Because they were Babylon was a sophisticated culture for that time.
Absolutely. Right. So this is 100%, right. The Babylonians had a lot, and their culture, right, had a lot to offer. We're going to look at kind of the bits and pieces, right, of why people stay, or really kind of looking at what it looks like to stay, right? Because I think we don't really get to see that picture a lot if we just look at the Hebrew Bible. And we're going to get more into kind of what some of that large scale being next to each other, being in the same kind of cultural milieu with one another over hundreds of years, what the result of that is next class, right? In the last class that we talked about. All right, so let's move on to just kind of a couple of sources in the Book of Kings, and then we'll get to what I think is kind of the more fun part of this. So who wants to read this source here?
I can read it, but before I do, could I ask a question about the end of the last one?
Absolutely.
What's the deal with the very violent language about smashing babies on rocks?
So it's a really good question, right? I think that to me speaks to the hatred and the real just terrible feelings of what it feels like to be conquered, right? And so on the one hand, we can look at it from our perspective and okay, they conquered Jerusalem 586, right? Dry historical facts. We know that, especially if we're looking at the Hebrew Bible, we're looking at sources from there, the things that happen in warfare nowadays we know are horrible. In the ancient world, how much the more so, right? Of kind of these terrible things that happen. And we know that, right, these kinds of things, so the Book of Lamentations or Eicha, right? We know there's just a terrible line, obviously, if you're anyone who has kids or anything like that, of you have a picture of parents eating their children to survive through the famine, through kind of this terrible deprivation that's happening. And so it's I think, trying to harken back to a time when maybe the exile community who had written this and who had gotten comfortable, when they could still channel some of that just raw hatred because of the terrible things that were done to them. Yeah, it's a great question. All right, Gilad, would you mind reading source number 3 for us?
Sure. Joachim?
Yeah, it's a rough first name to start off with. Yes, Joachim, perfect.
Joachim was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Nehushta, daughter of Elnatha of Jerusalem. He did what was displeasing to the Lord, just as his father had done. At that time, the troops of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon marched against Jerusalem, and the city came under siege. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon advanced against the city while his troops were besieging it. Thereupon, King Joachim of Judah, along with his mother and his courtiers, commanders, and officers, surrendered to the king of Babylon. The king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. He carried off from Jerusalem all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He stripped off all the golden decorations in the temple of the Lord, which King Solomon of Israel had made, as the Lord had warned. He exiled all of Jerusalem, all the commanders and all the warriors, 10,000 exiles, as well as all the craftsmen and smiths. Only the poorest people in the land were left.
Sorry, one more sentence at the bottom here.
And the king of Babylon appointed Mattaniah, Joachim's uncle, king in his place, changing his name to Zedekiah.
Good. Okay. So what happens here in a nutshell? What's happening in these verses from the Book of Kings? And then, right, what happens and why, potentially? Do we know why?
Because King Jehoiakim did what was displeasing to God. God sends King Nebuchadnezzar to conquer him and carry off all the treasures of Jerusalem and of the Holy Temple, and he sets up a puppet king in his place. Good. Okay, right. So if we're just reading the Book of Kings here, we obviously get the very right. I'm not saying that it's more biased than any other source in the ancient Middle East, right? As we read last week, the Assyrian sources are plenty biased and want to show the Assyrian king in the best light possible. But here, right, the reason why Jerusalem is conquered is not because of any sort of political failing or anything like that by Jehoiachin. Instead, right, the only reason that's given, and it's not even a direct reason that's given,
but he did what was displeasing to the Lord, just as his father had done, right? And so then right after that, Nebuchadnezzar comes and besieges the city and doesn't fully destroy it, but he levies a massive payment from the king, ships the king off with really anyone who can do any sort of skilled labor, anyone who's part of the royal entourage, and ships them off to Babylon. All right. If we were reading the Assyrian or the Babylonian source here, which unfortunately we don't have Babylonian sources that are like the Assyrian sources that we saw, but what we would probably read was Jehoiachin rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, right? He said, I'm not going to pay you tribute. He probably said, right, I'm going to ally myself with some of these other kings around me, and we're going to try to rebel against you. And so Nebuchadnezzar comes and basically says, all right, if you want to rebel against me, this is what's going to happen, right? I'm going to besiege your city, and I'm going to make you pay me. And not just that, I'm going to make you pay me more than you did before, right? It's kind of a classic mob shakedown. Okay, good. So that's what's going on in this source here. We're going to skip, or we're going to read source 4 just to give us, right, this is kind of a little taste of what the Babylonian sources that we do have, what they sound like and what they feel like. So who would like to read this, source 4?
I can read.
Go for it.
In the 6th year, in the month of Kislev, the king of Akkad, Nebuchadnezzar II, mustered his army and marched to Hatti land, Syro-Palestine. From the Hatti land, he sent out his companies, and scouring the desert, they took much plunder from the Arabs, their possessions, animals, and gods. In the month of Adar, the king returned to his own land. In the 7th year, the month of Kislev, the king of Akkad mustered his troops, marched to the Hatti land, and besieged the city of Judah. And on the 2nd day of the month of Adar, he seized the city and captured the king, Jehoiachin. He appointed there a king, Zedekiah, of his own choice, receiving its heavy tribute and sent to Babylon.
Yeah.
All right.
Some cooking.
So how do these sources describe the action? How does source 4 here that we just read, how does that describe the action that we saw in verse 3, right? If you just had verse 4 in front of you, what would you believe happened, or how would you kind of understand what happened between Nebuchadnezzar and Jehoiachin and Jerusalem and things like that, right? Was this out of the ordinary in any sense?
It was simply a battle between sides, and the Babylonians were more powerful. They won. It's not a matter of a holy war.
Right. So it's obvious, definitely not a matter of kind of, right, Yahweh or kind of this God of Israel choosing sides and saying that because Jehoiachin did something displeasing, right, I'm now going to say that Nebuchadnezzar can come and conquer. Absolutely, right? There's none of that here. What's interesting is that there's not even kind of a mention of a battle, right? It's, to me, these are chronicles, right? So these are chronicles that we have from King Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and they're extremely terse. And what the terseness of the chronicles does is it just makes it a kind of a matter-of-fact thing, right? If you read, the reason why I gave us a year before and then the year that we actually care about here is because if we look at both of these years, right, the king goes out on campaign in the same month, right, in the month of Kislev, which we know is kind of, right, November, December. And then he goes to the same place in both, right? He goes to kind of the west if you are in Iraq. And he goes and he, tries to, in this case, he basically says, all right, there are kind of Arab tribes that are marauding there. And so we need to stop that from happening. And so we're going to, dispossess the Arabs. The next year he goes and, okay, this Judean king potentially rebelled against me, but that's not even included here, right? But so I'm going to go and I'm going to seize that city and put in a new king in his place. All right. And so these two sources, like I said, from their very kind of terse nature, you get to see little bits and pieces, which are fun from a historical perspective. One, right, that the king is kind of going out to campaign in the same month of each year. Why do we think that might be, right? If he's going out to campaign November, December, why might that happen?
Would weather be a factor?
So weather may be a factor, right? Obviously, the weather is not going to be great, meaning you might get rain from that at that time. But that being said, the weather is going to be a lot better than it would be in July or August, right? When it's going to be scorching and you could not imagine, hiking 20 miles in a day across different sides of the Middle East, for sure, right? So weather is an issue. What else might be?
And that maybe he's got soldiers, it's the time of year where he can take his citizens out of their farms and conscript them for the 2 months that they've got to serve in his army.
Absolutely. Right. So at this point, you do have a standing army. That being said, you also have individuals who join and as part of their labor go, right, as kind of as what we would consider taxes, right? They go and they perform service for the king. And so one of those services would be to serve in kind of the army. And so what's happening here? Okay, your harvest has fully come in, right? We know Sukkot is kind of, right, this harvest festival. And so September, October is when you're bringing in your harvest. Maybe that drags on a little bit so that by November, December, your harvest is in. You're not planting the next crop yet. Great. Let's go out. Let's campaign. And let's make sure, by the way, that we're back before the spring starts, right? They come back in Adar. They come back in March before, any of the really intensive farm labor would start happening. Okay. Good, right? But there is a seasonality to these things. All right, this next source, we're going to skip over this. This is basically Nebuchadnezzar actually conquering Jerusalem and what that looks like. Right, we have a similar just bit at the end here that the only people that are left in the land are kind of the poorest people of the land. All right, that's it. And then who wants to read source 6 here, which is the last, really the end of the book of Kings?
Start again. In the 37th year of the exile of King Joachim of Judah, on the 27th day of the 12th month, King Evil-Merodach of Babylon, in the year he became king, took note of King Joachim of Judah and released him from prison. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a throne above those of other kings who were with him in Babylon. His prison garments were removed, and Joachim received regular rations by his favor for the rest of his life. A regular allotment of food was given him at the instance of the king, an allotment for each day, all the days of his life.
Great, thank you. All right, how is Joachim depicted here, and how is Evil-Merodach, great name that in Akkadian means something like man of Marduk, right? So, but here, obviously, right, you can't have an English translation and your name be evil and not, people not think of you that way. But how is the Babylonian king Evil-Merodach, and how is the Judean king Joachim depicted here?
Joachim comes out as a good guy.
Okay, right. Joachim seems like a pretty good guy, I guess, right? What action does he do?
He pardons the king.
Right, so you have, right, Evil-Merodach, right, the king of Babylon, pardoning Joachim, absolutely. So this Babylonian king, who we know his predecessor, right, Nebuchadnezzar II, who was actually his father, he obviously is depicted extremely negatively, right, throughout the Hebrew Bible. You have this next king coming, and things start to change a little bit, right? He's depicted as pretty benevolent, right, pardoning Joachim to some degree at least, right, not letting him go back to his land, but at least, right, kind of setting him above other kings, giving him regular rations, all those kinds of things. Joachim here, though, is passive, right? He doesn't do anything. He is someone who action is kind of taken for his benefit. And I think that really shows the place of Judean royalty in the Babylonian court, right? That we're not talking about someone who rotted in prison and his life was terrible and all those things like that. That being said, we're still talking about someone who, for all intents and purposes, is a prisoner of court, right? Who doesn't really have any sort of actual agency, all right? What we do have, which is kind of fun, and the reason why I brought that up, is because we have a tablet. It's called the Joachim Rations tablet, right? This is written in Akkadian. And so who would like to read this? It's a lot of metrology, right? A lot of measurements, but we get to a fun part a few lines in. So who wants to read source 7 here?
I'll try that one.
Yeah.
Okay, 2 seahs and 1/2 cube of 25 water carriers of the entrance, 1/2 Q each, under the responsibility of Istar Saru Usur. 3, 1/2 Q of 7 courtiers, 1/2 Q each, under their responsibility of Remutu. 2 Q of Abdi Milki, the soldier. 1 and 1/2 Q of 3 Arwadian carpenters, 1/2 Q each. 1 Seah and 1.5 Q of 8 Ditto Biblions, 1 Q each, still to be delivered, 1/2 Q. 3.5 Q of 7 Ditto Ionians, 1/2 Q each. 1/2 Q to Inanna Etir, the carpenter. 1 Seah to Joachim, king of Judah. 2.5 Q of 5 sons of the king of Judah, under the responsibility of Kana Yama. 3 Q for the wagons, under the responsibility of Sa Nabu Su.
Good. We can pause here just because the rest is kind of broken up a little bit. But I appreciate, I think you read that like a champ, not only with the names, but also the foreign metrology and things like that, right? This is something, if you're an accountant, I think you would appreciate this, right? This is Babylonian record keeping at its best, right? This is, okay, who has gotten their grain allotments and who has not gotten their grain allotments? And whose responsibility was it to get those grain allotments from point A to point B, okay? Why am I showing you this here? Why is this interesting?
But what's interesting to me with listing of the courtiers, the soldiers, the carpenters, right smack in the middle is Joachim.
Great, right smack in the middle, we have the king of Judah.
Else.
Yeah, right, and we care about him, right, as, oh, king of Judah, right, and that's where we're focused here. But the people who are writing this, they don't care that he's the king of Judah any more than they care that we have Arwadian carpenters that are also owed some sort of rations, right? And so for them, this is just, okay, this is the next person in line. What else though? Because there is something actually interesting here about Yoachin and about how much he gets.
Can I ask a question first?
Please.
Why does this exist? Is this in a holy book of some kind?
No, so that's, Evan, that's a great question, right? The reason why this exists is because, for two reasons. One, Babylonians, so the Babylonians and Assyrians, the people who lived in now modern day Iraq, southern Turkey, things like that, on the one hand, were compulsive list makers. And right, that doesn't say anything about kind of their character. It says kind of the culture that they grew up in, that the culture was a list making culture. All right. I'm married to someone who is a compulsive list maker, and so I appreciate that very, very much. But that being said, right, not only are they compulsive list makers, the problem is nowadays we to some degree are compulsive list makers. We don't really think about it though, because we get a receipt from the supermarket and we throw it away, right? It's paper, it decomposes in, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years. If it's in a landfill, maybe longer, right? That being said, these people wrote on clay tablets, and so their supermarket receipts lasted for thousands of years, right? We have receipts of things that people probably threw away as soon as it stopped mattering, right? No one cared about this after all of the different rations were already delivered, right? This is probably kind of a monthly thing that happened or a yearly thing that happened. But because they wrote on clay, it's preserved for us, right? And because the place that they wrote on clay, they didn't have a lot, right? There's not a lot of rain. There's not a lot of flooding that goes on. So the clay is going to stay pretty well in the sand or in the soil there. Great question. So I'm gonna kind of give you what I think is fun here. Not only is that Yoachin is just kind of right in the middle here, and right amongst these other people who are getting rations. The thing that's interesting though is that he actually does get a lot more rations than everybody else. All right. Yeah. So if we look at the metrology, we can kind of tease it out ourselves. But one seah is one ku or 1 Q is equal to 6 Q is equal to 1 seah. Okay, so we have 1 seah is equal to 6 ku, and so most other people here only get a half ku, or in one case here 1 ku, right? So these kind of these Biblians do get 1 ku each, which means that okay, they get more rations than most other people who get a half ku each. That being said, Yoachin the king gets 6 times that, right? He gets 6 ku, and so that's showing us that, right? Yoachin, when we kind of read here, that he gets this regular allotment and he was in favor and was maybe set above somebody else. Maybe, right? Because what we're seeing here is that he gets a lot more food or a lot more rations than these other people who we're talking about here. The other interesting thing or important thing to note is that this tablet is about 30 years. If we're talking about absolute dates here, this tablet was written in around 592 BCE. Evil Merodach didn't come to the throne until 562 BCE. So it seems like at this point, Yoachim was already getting preferential treatment, and that's 30 years before Evil Merodach had come to the throne, when Nebuchadnezzar was already king in Babylon, or was still king in Babylon. Okay.
So what I found was interesting is also that the 5 sons of the king of Judah get 2.5 Q, much less than King Joachim.
Absolutely, right? All the sons get kind of the normal half coup allowance that everybody else does, right? They get the same amount that the Ionian carpenters, the Biblian, or not the Biblian carpenters, they're special, but they get the same amount that the Ionian carpenters, the Arwadian carpenters, meaning carpenters from Cyprus, right, these other individuals get, absolutely, right? His sons aren't as special as Joachim. Good. All right, I want to move on here because I want to get to the Babylonian sources, but we're going to switch gears here a little bit, and we're going to actually talk about what being in exile was like, okay? Because if we look at the biblical sources, what's really interesting to me is if you're looking for firsthand accounts or even descriptions of what it was like to be in exile, you get very few. For a book or for books that were, at the very least, scholars agree were kind of edited, extensively during this period, some would even say fully written in this period, it's very interesting that there's very little that's actually said about what it's like to be in exile. So I picked out a couple of sources here for us to read, and then we can look at what the Akkadian sources, what these Babylonian sources say themselves, okay? So who wants to read source 8 here from Jeremiah?
I could read it, Zach, if you want.
Go for it.
Okay. This is the text of the letter which the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the priests, the prophets, the rest of the elders of the exile community, and to all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. Thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to the whole community which I exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease, and seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the Lord in its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper.
Great. Okay. Anyone read this? Is this kind of surprising to anyone? And if so, why?
Basically telling him to go on, live your lives, go and prosper in this foreign land.
Absolutely, right? Go on, prosper in this foreign land. If we compare it to Psalm 137 at the beginning, it's not the diametric opposite, but pretty close, right? Instead of always remember Jerusalem, never forget what these terrible people did to you, it's live your life, right? You not only live your life, but pray the city that you live in, pray on its behalf to your God, because if your city prospers, then you're going to prosper too, right? This is something that, Eileen, did you have a question or a point?
It feels to me like it's almost a directive about how to live in exile, that it's saying thrive there, don't just hang out, don't just wait and to return. Make sure you protect yourselves, make sure you that you prosper and that the city itself prospers as well. So you will do better. And I guess that's the best way to serve God.
100%, right? And I think that's something that we take for granted because we've been living in exile for thousands of years. And thinking about it potentially in prayers, right? And times of year, things like that. But for the most part, not really thinking about it unless things get bad for us. But right, we as kind of the exiles, we chose this path, right? We chose, Jeremiah basically says, this is what you should be doing, live your life, and not only do as well as you can, but kind of pray for the country, the city that you're living in. And that's kind of what we've done, right? And I think that it's not It's surprising because it didn't have to go that way, right? We know for tens, dozens of other communities that were exiled by the Babylonians and Assyrians, maybe they prospered, right? But they didn't retain kind of a sense of identity. And what's interesting is that we've combined, right, this kind of exhortation from Jeremiah to say, live your life in exile, with this exhortation from Psalm 137, which is never forget Jerusalem, right? And never forget these things that were done to you. Okay, great. We're just going to move on really quickly. Who wants to read kind of this very famous bit from Ezekiel 37, also about the exile?
Okay, I can do one.
Great.
And he said to me, O mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up, our hope is gone, we are doomed. Prophesy therefore and say to them, thus said the Lord God, I am going to open your graves and lift you out of the graves, O my people, and bring you to the land of Israel. You shall know, O my people, that I am the Lord, when I have opened your graves and lifted you out of your graves. I will put my breath into you, and you shall live again, and I will set you upon your own soil. Then you shall know that I am the Lord, have spoken and have acted, declares the Lord.
Perfect. Right. So these are words that we read every Passover. Right. This is kind of a very famous part of the book of Yechezkel, of Ezekiel. What's the point of view here, though? Right. What is exile here?
Well, I'm comparing it to what we had from Jeremiah, who was saying that you should be part and parcel of the society. And Ezekiel is saying, but don't worry, when the time comes, I will bring your bones back to Israel.
Good. So on the one hand, you're right that Ezekiel's definitely saying you're going to return to Israel, right? Don't worry, you're going to return to Israel. But what, right? When
But the image seems to be that currently we're all dried up.
Great.
Right? It's like,
yes.
Right. It's like it's not a fruitful place being in exile.
Yep. Right. It seems like this was maybe a folk saying, right? That our bones are dried up, our hope is gone, we are doomed, right? Yavshu atzmotenu va'avda tikvatenu nigzarnu lanu. Okay. And so it seems like this is kind of the total opposite of what we see in Jeremiah, that it's not, okay, maybe go and prosper, do all these things. That being said, right now, because we're not in our own land, we're done. We're dead, right? We are dried bones. We are, right? We're finished. And so Yechezkel has to come and prophesy to the people and say to them, listen, right? God's going to bring you back to the land, because it's only on your own land or in your own land that you can actually thrive and survive. All right. I think that for the most part, the view that we get throughout the Hebrew Bible, even though it's a very, very constrained view, is that exile it's a mix of these two things, right? It's kind of this idea that everybody really wants to be going back to their own land. They want to be going back to the land of Israel, and we'll see, right, how true that is. But that being said, people didn't do too terribly in exile, okay? And so we're not going to read the whole source of Ezra because we don't really have a lot of time. But basically what we have is kind of, right, Cyrus the Great of Persia telling the people who are in exile that they can go back to their land, they can go back to Jerusalem, they can rebuild the temple there. And for those people that are going to go back, make sure, right, that the people that are still left in Babylonia, that those people in Babylonia are going to give you, right, over here, all their neighbors supported them with silver vessels, with gold, with goods, with livestock, precious objects, okay? So on the one hand, yes, there are people that went back. On the other hand, the exiled community has access to silver and gold and livestock and precious objects, right? This is a community that's thriving. And Ezra, as we know, Ezra is within kind of the royal retinue of Cyrus, right? This is not kind of a Joe Schmo, right? This is a high-level official, Nehemiah, right? Nehemiah is a high-level official in the Persian royal court. And so it seems like, right, that even though this whole book is about, Jews want to go back, Judeans who are exiled want to go back to their land and rebuild the temple, when they're living in Babylonia, when they're living under this empire, things have been good. Okay.
So Zach, a quick question.
Yeah.
I don't know, a quick answer. So they go into exile to Babylon. They're there 70 years or so. And is this the first time that is noted of prayer? I mean, how did they remain Jewish? I mean, if you think about it, the kingdom of the Israelite kingdom, went into exile, and boom, they were gone almost immediately.
Absolutely.
So what is it? What took place in this kingdom?
Yeah, Norm, it's a really good question. The answer is that we don't really know, right? We don't know exactly how that happened, because you're 100% right. You look at the Northern Kingdom, and it's easy to just kind of see, all right, well, they assimilated, right? They turned into all the other places that they were living. They became members of those society, and okay, that's how it was, right? And so this kind of, it seems like, right, this longing did keep the community together, and this idea of prayer. There's some really good sources for exile communities not within the land of Israel, specifically within Egypt, actually building a temple to the Judean God in Egypt and praying to him there. And so what's interesting, right, is that if we read the Hebrew Bible and fully believe exactly what it's telling us, building a temple anywhere outside of Jerusalem is wrong, right? You cannot do that. You should not do that. What's interesting, though, is that the people, right, who were actually living this life in exile in Egypt did that, right? They built a temple to their God and kept everything going. And so there's definitely some discussion about whether the same thing happened in Babylonia. We haven't found a tablet or a text that told us that it did yet. That being said, tomorrow or next week, somebody could dig that up, right? And so that would be kind of a really interesting bit, right, in this whole story here. But it's a great question, Norm, and the sad answer is that we don't have a good answer to it. All right, we're gonna skip over this source of, right, Daniel is fun just because it's
Can I ask a question first?
Yeah.
The previous passage that talked about God resurrecting basically dead people, are we supposed to take that as a metaphor or as a promise?
It's a good question. I would say that it's both, right? It's definitely a metaphor from the perspective that there's kind of this folk saying, our bones are dried up, our hope is gone, we're doomed. And so the idea of kind of, right, God resurrecting the community is supposed to definitely be read as a metaphor. That being said, it's not fully clear that it shouldn't also be read in real life, right? That there's also this idea that God is going to, right, this kind of God of Judah is going to bring all of these individuals back to, or their bones at least, right, back to Judah, back to their own land. I have a really good friend, Carrie Sonia, who actually just wrote a book that was published. I forgot the title, but I think it might be kind of Caring for the Dead in the Hebrew Bible or Ancient Israel. And she talks about this passage and kind of how, right, the ways that it's connected to funerary culture, right? This is obviously, it's very dense, scholarly, this and that, but it's interesting, right, if you're interested in this kind of stuff. Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to skip over Daniel, which is kind of, right, the archetypal story of Judeans or Jews excelling academically and therefore being rewarded for excelling academically. What's interesting, though, and what I just want to kind of keep note here is that we have some name changes going on, right? So Daniel gets his name changed to Belshazzar, right? And then his companions get their names changed as well. Okay, good. We're now going to move on to the Babylonian sources, okay? And the Babylonian sources, we're going to kind of ground ourselves in this map here. We don't know exactly where the sources that we're going to be looking at are from this place called Judah Town, okay? In Akkadian, it's called Al Yahudu, and Al Yahudu basically means the city of the Judeans, okay? And this kind of city of Judeans, Judah Town, if you will, was probably located within this triangle, okay, in what is now southern Iraq. Babylon, just for kind of reference, Babylon is very close to modern day Baghdad, okay? So it's southeast of modern day Baghdad is probably where this place was, all right? These tablets were excavated illicitly, meaning they weren't found in a regular archaeological excavation like so many tablets were. They were sold on the antiquities market in the 19th and 20th centuries, but they were just published recently, and I think they're pretty interesting. So I'm going to read some of these, and then we're going to kind of go into it. All right. 2 kor of barley and 2 shekels of silver of 87.5% purity are owed to Belshar Utsur, son of Nuba, by Tzidkiyama, son of Shilimu. In ER, he will deliver the barley, and in addition, 48 liters per 108 liters of barley. He will repay the silver according to the current prices of barley in ER. His quiver fee field, as much as belongs to him in the city, the country, is a pledge to Bel-Shar Utzur. And then we have kind of witnesses. And then we have, this is written in Judah town in the 10th day of Adar, unclear what year it is, during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II. Okay, so this is, once again, I wish we kind of had more time to kind of go through this and unpack this naturally. But the reason why this source is really interesting, there are a lot of different reasons here. One, just to kind of get us very clearly what's happening here, it's a legal text, right? This is kind of one of those texts that Evan asked about, like, why is this preserved? The reason why it's preserved is because they wrote on clay, but this was a legal agreement that had to do with 1 year during the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, probably sometime between 587 when Jerusalem was destroyed and 563 when Nebuchadnezzar died. And this is basically, right, this is a note that's basically saying, all right, I'm going to promise you this barley and this other barley as interest on top of it, right? And then you're going to have my whole field as collateral, right? This is a legal document that's drawn up between two parties. Why is this interesting here, right? Why are we talking about this? Are there any names here that at first blush seem to be Judean, right? How would we know this is a Judean document?
Well, ER is that's a month, if I'm not mistaken.
Good. Okay. Right. So the months, what's interesting, ER and Adar, we have months here, but if we go all the way back to, I think it was source 4, is that right? Yeah. Source 4, we see that in a Babylonian document, we have those months as well, right? We have Kislev, we have Adar. And what's interesting is the way that the Judeans actually got their months, right? The way we got our months, the Jewish months that we call them, they're actually Babylonian months, right? We took them from the Babylonians. And what's great is if you look in the Hebrew Bible for when these months first start popping up, they first start popping up in the prophetic books during the, right? So prophets like Zackariah, who was a prophet during the exile, right? And kind of the return as well. And what's interesting is the first time these months are named, they're not just, okay, Kislev. They're Kislev, which is the 9th month, right? Because they have to kind of explain to the reader which month this is, because this is a new system that they're putting in, a new system of month names. Good, okay? So they have months that we now know because we've been using this system for a couple thousand years more, but those month names are actually Babylonian months, okay? What tells us that, and we wouldn't really know, right, that this is a Judean document unless we could kind of read some of these names. So
Right, so Shalom, we've got Shalom there.
Good, right? Shilimu, right, is probably something connected to Shalom, okay? And the real, that's good you picked up on that for sure. The real kind of icing on the cake is this name Tzidkiyama, okay? And the reason why it's icing on the cake is because the Yama is the divine element that it's kind of like the end of a name, like, so, right, my name is Zach or Zackary, my Hebrew name is Zachariah. So if I were a Judean living 2,500 years ago, my name would either be Zachariah or Zacharyahu. Okay, so Yahu at the end of a name, so like Eliyahu. Okay, Yahu is the name of the Judean god, right? We don't pronounce that in a real way nowadays, but from a scholarly perspective, right? People say, okay, maybe it's something like Yahweh or something like that, but Yahu is the name of the Judean god, and so a name like Eliyahu is my God is Yahu, right? Eli, my God is Yahu. Here, Tzidkiyama is, right? Yahu is my kind of righteousness, if you will, right? Is my tzedek, right? So Tzidkiyama is actually, right? We should kind of be reading this as Tzidkiyahu or something like Tzidkiyahu, who coincidentally is the last king of Judah, right? This is a different Tzidkiyahu or Tzidkiyama. You're going to ask yourself, how did we get from Yahu to Yama? And there's a whole lot of kind of phonological changes that happen. But what's just important to keep in mind is that we have names that both kind of have a Yama element, and we know that that is kind of this Yahu element that we know from the Hebrew Bible. But we also have names written in Akkadian where they have a Yahu element at the end instead.
Oh my goodness, and we've got Michael.
Yes, right. So we have later on, good, Mikayama, right? So it's actually, instead of Michael, it's actually Micha, right? This is like, right? This is the who is like Yahoo, right? So Mikael instead of in terms of Michael, but also Micha, absolutely, right? And if we can look at this, right, we see, oh, I know a lot of these names, you know? So what's interesting here, we're gonna just move on really, really quickly. What's interesting here is that the reason why we know that these are Judean tablets is because we have a lot of Judean names in them. And that's really the 99.9% of the way that we can identify how someone is Judean, right? No one can self-identify. We don't have a census saying these are how many Judeans are living in Babylonia at this time. The only way we know is by names. And while that's good sometimes, it's not good sometimes, okay? So here we have another text where we have barley that's owed to Yahushar Utsur, son of Nuba, by Tzidkiyama, son of Shilimu. Okay, we know Tzidkiyama, son of Shilimu. We met him in our last text. This guy, Yahushar Utsur, son of Nuba, if we go to our earlier text, we actually have, we have Belshar Utsur, son of Nuba. Okay, so here it looks like what's happened. So Belshar Utsur literally means Bel, protect Utsur, Shar, the king, right? So, O Bel, protect the king. So what's interesting here is that it seems like this guy Belshar Utsur also went by the name Yahushar Utsur, which means literally Yahu, right? Kind of God of Judah, protect the king. And what's interesting about it is that, right, this name Bel is in normal kind of good Babylonian or Akkadian, this is connected to the god Marduk. So if we first just saw this name and didn't see this other tablet that we had, we would think, all right, this guy's a Babylonian, right? He has a good Babylonian name. The god who he's invoking in his name is Marduk. It all checks out. That sounds good. That being said, here, obviously we see that it's a different story. And instead of the normal association of Baal or Bel with Marduk, we have here the association of Yahu, right? The god of Judah with Baal. And so before anyone says, okay, well, it's odd because the whole Hebrew Bible is kind of against Baal and for the God of Judah. Think about, right? So in the book of Judges, we have the story of Gideon or Gidon. And what's interesting is that Gideon is also called Yerub-Baal, right? Meaning Baal will contend. And so before, right, it's very clear that Gideon or Gidon is all for kind of this Judahite God. But he is equating, right, at least in his name, the person who named him equated that Judahite god with Baal, or with kind of this this god who is otherwise, right, his name means something like Lord or Master, okay? And so it's interesting here that our whole basis of identification, that we can only know if someone is Judean if they have a Judean name, well, that it gets turned on its head a little bit, because now we see that there are also names that look like they're Akkadian, but they're actually Judean. I know we're over time. I'm just going to show you one more text because it's a lot of fun. This is a text that's from 419 BC. This is from 150 years after the destruction of the temple, okay? The reason why this text is a lot of fun is because we have a number of people, some of whom definitely have Judean names. So Zabad Yama, right? Yahu or the God of Judah will provide, all right? They go and talk to some other people, and they said, give us 5 fishing nets. We'll give you 500 fish of standard quality by the 15th of Tishrei. And if we don't give you those 500 fish of standard quality by the 15th of Tishrei, we'll give you 1,000 fish by the 20th of Tishrei, right? This is a contract that is drawn up on the 25th of Elul. Right? The reason why that's interesting is because think of the Jewish holidays that occur at that time, right? This is a contract written 5 days before Rosh Hashanah that basically says, all right, you're going to lend us 5 big fishing nets. We're going to catch a lot of fish, so many fish that we can afford to pay you 500 of the fish that we catch as payment, right? Meaning we're going to be able to sell, let's say 2,000, 3,000, whatever fish, right? Above market price, because we know that our community of Judeans, is going to need it not only for Rosh Hashanah potentially, but also for Sukkot, right? Because we're going to give you these 500 fish. They're going to be due really the first day of Sukkot. But we can also say if that was really profitable for us, or if we can tell that this is already going to be really profitable, we can switch up the contract a little bit, and we could change it so that we owe you 1,000 fish on the 20th, right? So those terms would be much better to the person who they're giving the fish to. And the reason why that would be is because this is happening during the middle of Sukkot, and the contract would come due the eve of Hoshana Rabbah, right? Hoshana Rabbah nowadays is not really that big of a holiday. It's very clear that, especially in Second Temple times, Hoshana Rabbah was a really big deal. And so we can tell from this tablet, or not tell, we can potentially infer that, a community existed of Judeans in Babylonia that not only thrived, but potentially also celebrated the holidays or festivals that we now know of connected to the Judeans. Obviously, none of that's written down here, right? It's not we're gonna buy these fish for Rosh Hashanah, or we're gonna try to catch these fish for Rosh Hashanah, right? None of that's said in the text. That being said, if we read this text, it seems like that's what's happening, right? So just kind of a fun little bit before we go here. All right, next class, next week, we're going to be talking about kind of the residue of all this, right? What does it look like if you've been living with or in modern day Iraq for hundreds of years, thousands of years? What does that look like in terms of how much does that rub off on your culture, right? How much of the culture of Nebuchadnezzar, right? Nebuchadnezzar II, who destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, how much of that culture is kind of incorporated in different ways into whether it's the Hebrew Bible, whether it is the Babylonian Talmud, whether it's the Dead Sea Scrolls or something like that. So we're going to be looking at that next week. I hope you've had a lot of fun. Obviously, feel free to ask any questions, whether it's in this class. I know we're running out of time and already overtime, but if you want to send me an email, feel free. All right. I appreciate it. Thanks so much. And I look forward to seeing everybody next week.
Thanks.
Thanks,
That was
Zach.
great. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah, good night, everybody.
How's that?
Bye-bye. Thanks, Ed.
Zach, just one last thing.
Yeah.
If you remember from the history, what you talked about, I think last week,
Mhm.
it's very easy for the Judeans to forget completely about God in like one to three kings.
Absolutely.
I mean, completely. And so that's the thing that really interests me is that, when we talked about that, there was no necessarily formal prayer until some point in exile.
Mhm.
I would have thought it would have come with the rabbinic culture, which probably came 300 BCE.
Mm-hmm.
This is 570, somewhere between 570 and 500, 570, 470 BC.
Mm-hmm.
Something else was going on already,
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you, Norman. That's why I said I think probably, right? Look, we could have kind of the beginnings of what people would call synagogue culture, right? Which we first kind of see in the archaeological record. I'm not totally sure on this because this is not my field, but I think kind of around 200 BCE, a little bit later, right? We kind of have the beginnings of synagogue culture. That being said, we could have that, right? We could have kind of this Judean community that stays in touch that way, or we could have what we see in these texts from Egypt from around 400 BCE, which describe kind of them building a temple to the Judean God and potentially carrying out sacrifices there, right? We're not sure, but potentially carrying out sacrifices in a place like that, which obviously if you just read the Hebrew Bible, that's a total no-no, right? You can't sacrifice anywhere else but Jerusalem. That being said, we know that before Hezekiah, people were sacrificing all over the place, right? And that's really kind of a centralization reform. Absolutely. So Norm, it's a great question. And it's one of those that, like I said, we could find a tablet that kind of has bits and pieces of that tomorrow. And that would be really cool if we did.
Well, right. The prohibition of not sacrificing outside of Jerusalem took place when?
It's a good question, right? So if you ask me from a source critical perspective, that to me that's a political move. Right? It's not necessarily a religious reform. It is a political reform, either by Hezekiah in around 700 or by Josiah around 640 or so, 650. And it's a way to basically say, all right, all of you kind of Judeans who are worshiping this Judean God, you can only sacrifice at the Jerusalem temple. And that brings me tax revenue, right? That brings me all of these individuals coming and spending their money and their sacrifices or sacrificing in Jerusalem itself. And so I would say that that's a political move as opposed to a religious prohibition. That being said, it is couched in terms of a religious prohibition in the Hebrew Bible.
Right. So Shlomo HaMelech didn't put in that prohibition.
Right. If you ask me, when Solomon had the temple, people were sacrificing all over the place, and yeah, maybe they would come to Jerusalem too.
Right. But that is the interesting part of how they stayed a people. Then when because some stayed, so some stayed and they developed the Babylonian Talmud later
Yeah.
on. So there had to have been some level of religious sustainment going on.
Absolutely. 100%, right? You don't stay together, not only through 70 years, right? Kind of through when Cyrus says, all right, you can now go back and rebuild the temple. But like you said, Norm, you stay as a community over hundreds and thousands of years. You don't do that unless you have strong cultural, ethnic, religious ties. Absolutely.
The only counter to that, and I'll leave you with this, is Soviet Jewry. And that when communism came in 1917, 18 or so, and they made very serious headways to destroy the Jewish culture.
Mm-hmm.
You've heard the old stories. Golda Meir shows up in 48, 30 years after communism started, 10,000 people, she walks into the synagogue on Simchas Torah in 1948, 49,
Mm-hmm.
10,000 people show up at the door.
Mm-hmm.
When they, all of a sudden, Israel wins the 6-Day War, has the synagogue. And what is that number? 500,000 Soviet Jews, before they let them out, decided they wanted to become Jewish again. I mean,
absolutely. It's also kind of, before I'll end it here, but I read a book that I didn't love, but I thought it was really interesting. It was set in England during the Spanish Inquisition. And the reason why I thought it was interesting is because I've never thought about this before, but it really brought to the fore to me the idea that we as Jews, right, that at every time when Jews have prospered in their country, whether that's England or Spain or whatever, right, Babylonia, you have a large percentage of the population that probably assimilates and probably stops being Jewish, right? They probably take on the local culture. We are the kind of the remnant of that small group that decided not to. You know what I mean? And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, that our population is so small, obviously for lots of reasons, pogroms, things like that, but also because of selectivity, if you will. You know what I mean? That people who are Jewish and are doing really well in the land that they're living in will very often stop fully identifying as Jewish. And then, obviously it becomes a whole nother discussion in terms of assimilation and things like that. But absolutely. All right. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it. Have a great night.